The morning sun was just beginning to paint the Montana grasslands in shades of amber and gold when Sarah Mitchell felt the sharp sting on her ankle, and she had been walking through the tall grass near the creek bed, searching for wildflowers to photograph. And the pain came so suddenly that she stumbled forward, catching herself on her hands and knees. And when she looked back, she saw the rattlesnake slithering away into the brush, and panic seized her chest like a cold fist. She tried to stand, but her legs felt weak and the world seemed to tilt sideways, and she knew she was alone out here miles from town, with nothing but her camera and a bottle of water in her backpack. And the nearest ranch house was somewhere beyond the ridge, but she had no idea how far. And already she could feel her ankle beginning to throb with a heat that seemed to spread up her calf like fire. Sarah was 53 years old and had come to Montana to escape the noise of her life back in Chicago. And after her divorce and after her children had grown and moved away, she had felt like a ship unmoored, drifting without purpose. And she had always dreamed of the wide open spaces of the West. And so she had packed her car and driven until the buildings gave way to mountains and the concrete turned to grass, and she had rented a small cabin on the outskirts of a town called Meadowbrook with a population of 800 souls, now lying in the grass with venom coursing through her veins. She wondered if this foolish dream would be the end of her. And she tried to remember what she had read about snake bites, and she knew she should stay calm and keep her heart rate down. But fear made her breathing quick and shallow, and tears began to stream down her face, and she called out for help even though she knew no one could hear her. That was when she heard the sound of hooves against the earth, and a horse and rider appeared over the rise, moving toward her with purpose. And the man dismounted before his horse had even come to a complete stop, and he was beside her in an instant, kneeling in the grass with his weathered hands already reaching for her ankle. He was somewhere in his early 60s with silver hair beneath a black cowboy hat and deep lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into the sun. And his face was kind but serious as he examined the bite. And he said his name was Thomas Brennan, and he owned the land she was on, and he had been checking fence lines when he spotted her. Thomas looked at the swelling around the 2 puncture marks, and without hesitation he bent down and put his mouth to her ankle. And Sarah felt the pressure as he sucked and spit, and sucked again, and she was too shocked and too frightened to protest, and when he finally sat back on his heels, his expression was grave but calm. She managed to whisper that she needed him to suck out the venom and that it was really swollen, and Thomas looked at her with something like tenderness in his eyes, and he said gently that he had already done that, and he had frozen in shock himself for just a moment when he first saw the bite, because he knew how serious it was and how little time they had. He lifted her into his arms, as if she weighed nothing, and carried her to his horse, and somehow he managed to get them both into the saddle, with Sarah cradled against his chest and his arms around her, holding the reins, and the horse began to move at a smooth, steady pace. That didn't jar her too much, and Thomas kept talking to her in a low voice, telling her to stay awake and stay with him. The ride to his ranch house felt like it took hours, though it was probably only 20 minutes, and Sarah drifted in and out of awareness. And she was conscious of the warmth of his body and the smell of leather and sage and horses and the sound of his voice telling her stories about the land and about his life. And she realized he was trying to keep her focused and keep her mind from the pain. When they reached the house, Thomas carried her inside and laid her on a leather sofa in a room with high ceilings and windows that looked out over the valley. And he called for someone named Maria, and a woman appeared, who must have been his housekeeper. And together they elevated Sarah's leg and applied cold compresses, and Thomas got on the phone with the hospital in the nearest city, which was 40 miles away. The ambulance would take at least an hour to reach, them maybe longer. And Thomas sat beside Sarah and held her hand, and he told her she was going to be fine, and that she was strong, and that he had seen people survive much worse. And his confidence was like an anchor, and she held on to it with everything. She had Maria brought cool water, and Thomas helped Sarah drink, and he wiped her forehead with a damp cloth, and he never once left her side. And Sarah found herself looking into his face and seeing something there that she had not seen in a very long time, and it was genuine care for another human being without any expectation of anything in return. The pain was intense now, spreading up her leg into her hip, and she could feel her heartbeat pounding in her ears, and she started to cry. Not just from the pain, but from the fear and from the overwhelming gratitude she felt toward this stranger who had appeared like an angel when she needed help most. and Thomas squeezed her hand and told her it was okay to cry, and that he was right there and he wasn't going anywhere. Sarah heard herself talking, though she didn't quite intend to, and she told Thomas about her life, and about the divorce, and about how her husband had left her for someone younger, and about how her children were busy with their own lives and rarely called, and about how she had felt so alone and so invisible, and how she had come to Montana hoping to find some kind of meaning or purpose, or at least some peace. Thomas listened without judgment, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he told her his own story, and he said his wife had died of cancer 7 years ago, and that they had never been able to have children, and that he had thrown himself into the work of the ranch to avoid feeling the emptiness of the house, and that some days the silence was so loud it hurt his ears. He said he understood what it meant to feel alone, and to wonder if anyone would notice if you just disappeared one day, and he said that was why he always checked the fence lines himself instead of sending his hired hands, because it gave him an excuse to ride out and see what was beyond the next hill, and to feel like he was still part of the world instead of just moving through it like a ghost. The ambulance arrived, and the paramedics rushed in with their equipment and their efficient movements, and they started an IV and checked her vital signs, and they said she had done the right thing by staying calm, and that Thomas had done the right thing too, and they loaded her onto a stretcher and carried her out to the ambulance. Thomas followed them outside, and before they closed the ambulance doors, he reached in and took her hand again, and he promised he would come visit her at the hospital. And Sarah nodded and tried to smile, and she watched his face until the door shut and blocked him from view. At the hospital, they gave her anti-venom and monitored her closely for the next 2 days, and the doctor said she was lucky that Thomas had found her when he did, and that his quick action had bought her precious time, and that the venom had been serious but not fatal. And Sarah lay in the hospital bed thinking about the man who had saved her life. True to his word, Thomas came to visit, and he brought flowers that Maria had cut from the garden at the ranch, and he sat in the uncomfortable hospital chair, and they talked for hours about everything and nothing, and Sarah felt something stirring in her chest that she thought had died years ago, and it was the feeling of hope. When she was released from the hospital, Thomas offered to drive her back to her cabin, and she accepted, and on the drive they passed the place where she had been bitten, and she looked out at the grass bending in the wind, and she thought about how close she had come to dying alone in that beautiful place. Thomas helped her into the cabin and made sure she had everything she needed, and before he left, he wrote his phone number on a piece of paper and told her to call if she needed anything, and he meant anything at all, and Sarah took the paper and held it like it was something precious. The next few weeks passed slowly as Sarah recovered and her ankle healed and the swelling went down, and she found herself thinking about Thomas constantly, and about the kindness he had shown her, and about the loneliness she had heard in his voice when he talked about his wife and his empty house. She called him one afternoon and asked if she could take him to dinner as a way of saying thank you, and Thomas was quiet for a moment, and then he said he would like that very much, and they met at a small restaurant in town, and they talked until the owner started stacking chairs on the tables, and they realized they were the last ones there. After that, they began to see each other regularly, and they would meet for coffee or take walks along the creek, or Thomas would invite her to the ranch and show her the horses and the land, and Sarah would photograph the sunsets and the wildflowers, and slowly she began to feel like she belonged somewhere. Again, one evening as they sat on Thomas's porch, watching the stars come out, Sarah said she wanted to thank him again for saving her life. And Thomas shook his head and said she had it backwards, and that she had saved his life too. And when she looked confused, he explained that he had been going through the motions for 7 years waiting for something to change, and that finding her that morning had reminded him that life could still surprise you, and that there were still people worth knowing and worth caring about. Sarah reached over and took his hand, and they sat like that in the darkness listening to